Okay, hello class. This malfunctioned on me a little bit here. Okay, here we are. Welcome, John Morrison isn't here. This is the lecture for Tuesday, April 14. I hope everyone had a good break over the Easter holiday. And as you can see, this is Tuesday, April 14th, but we are following the Monday schedule. So, this is what we will be doing this week, romantic music. Today we'll be giving an introduction to romantic music from 1820 to 1910, and focusing on one composer, Franz Schubert. Then next class, Wednesday, Hector Berlioz will be an example of a orchestral music, which will be a close to see how the orchestral composers are taking Beethoven's ideas into new territory. We'll talk a little bit about that today as an introduction to romantic music. And then Friday, we will be talking about Chopin, listening to a piece for solo piano, and also introducing 20th century music on that day. Okay, so today, introduction to romanticism, a piece for voice and piano, and then we'll have a big orchestral piece next class, and then a solo piano piece, just to give a snapshot of some of the main things that are happening in the Romantic period. Here we are on our syllabus, 1800 to 1910. The genres that we will be listening to, I introduced these briefly at the end of the last lecture. Lieder, German word for songs. Lied would be the singular. So we'll call these art songs. There are two types, strophic, which would be similar to popular music, where you have a different text for each stanza, or you might say different lyrics for each verse, right? If we're thinking in terms of a modern song, we think in terms of verses. So you have the same music, but different lyrics for each verse. That would be a strophic song, same music repeated, but the words change. Through composed is exactly what it says. The music is through composed. The music changes throughout, harmonically and melodically, just as the text does. Excuse me. Program symphony. Okay, we already know what a symphony is, right? Multi-movement composition for large orchestra. It's still that. It's a multi-movement composition for large orchestra. But we'll see with Berlioz that we have different, we don't adhere to specific compositional forms like we did in the classical period. Theme and variation, sonata form, rondo, minuet and trio. Remember all that? So forms are more uniquely defined from one composition to another. There's always form, but it is unique to that piece. And we'll be talking about an etude there. Etude is a French word for study. So study literally means that, music that teaches a particular type of technique, but also if you're a good composer, a great composer as Chopin was, it's also more than that. It's musical, right? It's something that people want to listen to. We already know what opera is, symphonic poem. That's kind of another word for program symphony. We're really not going to get into that. Cyclic form, under forms, meaning, as we recall from the Beethoven, that motive, remember, ba 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 bum, ba-ba-ba-bum. That's the opening motive that creates the first theme, and then it becomes sonata form. Well, with Berlioz, he has that idea. He has a motive or a melody that goes through all the different movements. He gets that idea from Beethoven, but he's not doing the specific forms that Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven did: theme and variation, rondo, minuet and trio, etc. And some of our terms. So we'll get to that as we get to that. So music of the Romantic period. There's Berlioz. There's an article that you can read, right? You have that link in your Wikipedia page. So I'm going to give you my broad overview of Romantic music. So 1820 to 1900, Romanticism, named after the literary movement by the composers themselves. And because of Beethoven, music is being seen more as an art rather than a craft. It's taken more seriously, right? I made reference to that the last time. Not that individual composers prior to Beethoven didn't, but it wasn't as they didn't speak out about it as boldly as Beethoven and Romantic composers and all artists from this period on tend to do. We could say this is the period of descriptive music as opposed to absolute music, or as you saw on your syllabus, program music. Okay, so music that is describing something. In many cases, instrumental music, right? But you would go to a concert in this period, be handed a program that in the program, there would be a synopsis of what the music was about. And we will talk and listen to that with the piece next class, Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique. So there is a story that is being told, okay? Some other things to consider with this music in general. Again, this isn't a music theory class, but we try to make sense of the music, talk about how the music is changing in terms of style. So Romantic composers in this period, we already talked about the forms are more individual from one piece to the next. These composers are also, as we will find in the piece today and the piece next class, attracted to dark subject matter, the macabre, nightmares and violence and obscure fantasy they're trying to project. So how do you do that in music? Well, it could be with dissonance. We'll find that the music in this period is more dissonant, more abstract, right? We know that word dissonance from our first exam. Music that's sounds not at rest. Subjectively speaking, we might say displeasing to the ear. So music is more dissonant. The melodies tend to be less symmetrical in the classical period, very symmetrical, almost like a folk song. You would have a even phrase, and the next phrase would be the same length, right? Remember that, how the melody is divided into sections. We'll point that out when we get there. This is, and also the way that a composer is making a living. We made reference to that, but this is the era of revolutions. Lower and middle classes are fighting for economic and social mobility. We have the French Revolution, we have the American Revolution, And with this comes the overthrowing of the aristocracy, which is a good thing for the lower and middle classes because they're having more independence and more chances to advance themselves socially and economically, right? But those comfortable positions no longer exist for these composers that Haydn and Mozart in particular that made a living that way. They now have to make a living in a new way, meaning sell their music to the public. So melody, getting back to the styles, the melody is more effusive, asymmetrical, we might say, more chromatic, playing notes outside the scale. Harmony, savored for its own sake. Sometimes we'll have music that just presents a harmony rather than a clear melody on top. Tone color, right? Just the quality of the orchestra as opposed to the melody sometimes takes precedence over what the melody is. We'll play an example of that in just a moment. There's a wider range of dynamics, even written in the music, and also the ability. Instruments have the ability to play louder than before. This is the era of the piano. The forte piano now becomes the piano as we know it, the modern piano, with a metal sounding board and thicker strings that are hammered, so wider dynamic range. The orchestra is getting better, bigger that is. More instruments in a standard orchestra, which allows you to play really loud, and you can still play really soft, just have fewer people play. New instruments are being developed, okay? So a flute is a high wind instrument. This period we have the piccolo, which is like a little flute, but it plays an octave higher. The bassoon is a wind instrument. Now we have the contrabassoon. The bassoon is in the low register. The contrabassoon is even lower. We talked about the introduction of trombones with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in the fourth movement. This period we have the tuba, which is a brass instrument and that plays even lower. So the range of brass winds especially are increasing. Different types of percussion are being used. So, and maybe, I don't know if I would say most important, but very important, rubato, right? I mentioned that word last time. There's even a link there. Rubato literally means rob time, to speed up or slow down a melody or the music at the composer's will or at the performer's will, right? So, of course, it's in the hands of the performer. The composer might write rubato in the music, telling the performer to slow down or speed up, but that's still open for interpretation as to how that is done. So, for example, here's our Beethoven Fifth Symphony we heard last class. Clear melody there, right? Ba-da-da-dum, 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 bum. All right, I can hum this. Ba-ba-ba-bum. It's a clear melody there. Okay. Now, here's Berlioz, Symphonie Fantastique. Let's hear a little of this. Listen, right off the bat, these are dissonant chords. They're diminished chords, but just think dissonant. We're creating an eerie sound, creating an atmosphere. What's the melody? Really isn't one. I couldn't really hum this. I could try, but wouldn't sound very good. Listen to that line. Right, we're creating a mood, dissonant chords. Diminished chord, which is a dissonant chord. So that's the piece that we'll listen to more closely next class. But I wanted to give you that back to back with Beethoven. So that is our introduction and comparison in a nutshell, how classical music is transformed into romanticism in terms of harmony, right? More dissonant, melody. Well, we'll hear some melody later. But melody is less symmetrical, less predictable, more chromatic. Tone color, the use of the orchestra to savor a sound by itself. Dynamic range, much wider, can play much louder, much softer. Even the range of the instruments, as I mentioned, if we have instruments that can now play higher than a flute, like the piccolo, or lower than a bassoon, like a contrabassoon, well, we have a wider register. And certainly rubato, speed up and slow down at a performer's will. And we'll hear that especially in the solo piano piece by Chopin. We won't be listening to that today. Okay, so today we're going to focus on this guy, Franz Schubert. Franz Schubert, born in Vienna. That's the hub of music at the time. So he's right where he needs to be. His dates are 1797 to 1828. As you could see, also does not live very long. He dies at the age of 31. He is not well known in his lifetime, right? There's often that old joke that artists aren't known until after they die. And of course, that's not always the case, but usually when these stereotypes are made up, there's some truth to them, because that happens sometimes with some painters, right? Some artists you may have discussed, like Vincent van Gogh, for example. And Franz Schubert would be an example. That didn't make a lot of money. He did get by. He was a teacher, and he taught music. He gave private lessons. He had some patrons, some friends that really believed in his talent and would support him in tough times, and he had a lot of them. But he didn't make a lot of money as a composer in his lifetime. He was a great admirer of Beethoven's, as so many composers were. And he lived in the same city as Beethoven, but yet he was a very shy person and never got the courage to introduce himself to his idol Beethoven. So he never met Beethoven. But he's directly influenced by him, as all of our composers are. And he writes some symphonies, again, modeled after Beethoven, trying to take him to the next level, if you will, or model them in his own style. But we're going to focus on his leader, his songs, art songs. And more specifically, we will be looking at this piece, the Earl King, right? The Earl King, one of his most famous songs, written in 1815 when he was a young boy, still a teenager, okay? And it's based on a poem by Goethe, an author, composer. An author and a poet. I meant to say, not composer, an author and poet of the period. And it's based on a poem by Goethe, spelled Goethe, is Goethe. And it's called The Erlking. And we're going to listen to that in a moment. So, let's see. Here it is, Schubert, The Erlking. It's in German. This is an example of a through-composed song. There's the English translation, which helps us understand what's going on, unless you speak German fluently, which I don't. This is a piece for solo piano and one singer. But the poem has 3 characters plus a narrator. So the singer has to convey these different characters with their voice. So how do they do that? So one character is the father. The father is riding through the night with his child that has a fever. Okay? So very simply, when the father is singing, it's in a low, gruff voice. When the child sings, it's in a higher register. Now the child sees and hears the demon Erlking, or Elf King, sometimes pronounced. And that would just be a fictitious character that represents death. Okay, so he sees the Erlking. And the Erlking is trying to invite the child to join him, to go away with him. And then the father, of course, says, when the child says this, the father says he thinks it's the fever. That's nothing. It's just the wind blowing through the trees. So the father in the low voice, the child in the high voice, frantic, sounding scared. When the Erlking sings, it's sort of in the middle register, and the song goes to the major mode. Okay, so for the most part, this is minor mode. But it goes to major because the Erlking is trying to lure the boy away, entice him to come with him, trick him. So, of course, he wants to say, oh, I'm a nice guy, come with me. So this back and forth goes on. Father, don't you see? No, there's nothing there. The Erlking continually trying to lure the boy away. Then when he gets frustrated, the boy, if he doesn't want to come willingly, he's going to take him by force. So he does. And then when the father gets home after his ride to get the boy home safe in bed to take care of him, the child dies in his arm. As you can see that written there. So, as I started today's class talking about the romantic composers being attracted to the macabre, it doesn't get much more macabre than that, right? A father's child dying in his arms. So this is the song that we're about to hear. And it is through composed, okay? So the music changes continually, but we do have some ideas in the piano part, which I'll point out at the very beginning, that do carry the whole way through, that represent the galloping of the horse, if you will. So let's get to that. And if you've already looked and listened, I'm going to play 2 examples of the Erlking, but the one we're going to listen to has this nice animation with it that helps convey the story for us. So, let me just start a little bit of this. I might pause it. Okay, that ow is not in the original, of course. That's all part of the animation. Starts with solo piano. right here, representing the galloping horse. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then that scary melody is throughout. But the melody and the chords change. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to pause it there because the lyrics were not written there. Okay, so that was the narrator. Who rides so late through the night and when? It is the father with his child. He holds the boy fast in his arms. He holds him tightly. He keeps him warm. Okay, so that was the opening section that we just heard. Okay, so I'm gonna let it continue from here. My son, why do you hide your face so anxiously? And the son says, do you not see, Father, the Earl King with his crown and train? My son, it is a streak of clouds. Notice the music goes to major here. You dear child, come with me. Such wonderful games I will play with you. So many beautiful flowers are on the shore. My mother has many a golden robe. My father, do you not hear what the Earl King softly promises me? Be calm, my child. Here comes the Earl King again. Dance like major sounding. Dear child, come with me. My daughter shall wait on you well. And so on. You get the idea. My father, do you not see there Earl King's daughter in the desolate place? And my son, I see it clearly. The old fields appear so gray. Here's the Earl King finally getting frustrated, saying, if you're not going to come willingly, I'm going to take you. The Earl King has seasoned me. Father, now the narrator, the father filled with horror rides fast.
In seinen Armen das Kind war tot.
So, war tot was dead. The child in his arms was dead. Okay, it's grim. All right, so for the fun of it, I'm going to play this one too. Same one, but here we get to see the performance of how this singer is going to convey this song. And I believe we will get an English translation, so I don't have to speak over this one. I might say a couple words, but I'll try to refrain. You could see the difficulty of the piano playing, right? Very consistently fast and rhythmically steady. Very difficult to do. Here he is. There's our singer. Look at him. He's serious. He means business. Narrator. Okay, that was the narrator. Here comes the father. Voice goes up when the child speaks. Low register for the father. Major mode. This is the Earl King. Now, the melody is changing throughout, as are the harmonies, the chords, but we still hear that rhythmic da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's constant, but everything else is evolving through composed. At the minor, getting more and more frantic.
Ich liebe dich, mich reizt deine schöne Gestalt. Und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt. Mein Vater, jetzt fass mich an. Der König hat mir ein Leids getan. Dem Vater grauset's, reitet geschwind, hält in Armen das ächzende Kind. Erreicht den Hof mit Mühe in seinen Armen das Kind war tot.
Okay, there it is. You get the idea. All right, so that's all we have for today. Whoops, didn't want to click on that. That's all we have for today. What did we talk about? Specifically, Franz Schubert, our first composer of the Romantic period. Like all of these guys, very much influenced and inspired by Beethoven. We have an example of Lieder from him. Lieder meaning songs, German for art songs. There are two types being written: strophic, which is similar to songs that popular songs we know, the same music over and over, but the lyrics change. What we just heard was a through composed song. The music evolves as the lyrics changed. And we talked about romantic music in general, how things are changing. Life is changing for the composer, right? This is the aristocracy has been overthrown. So you can't get a job there. You have to sell your music to the public, which is the way it is now, and this is the period where that really begins. And we talked about the style, so keep the style in mind when you listen to the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, which I played a few excerpts, or one excerpt of today, just to compare it to Beethoven, how it differs in terms of melody, harmony, tone color, dynamics, right? So I think that's it for today. We'll pick up from there and review a little bit of that general style as we listen more closely to the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique. See you on Wednesday.